Hi, Zehra. How are you doing? Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Paul. I'm excited to see what we're going to cover.
Hopefully, a quick one today. I had an idea and I thought you'd be the perfect person to talk about it. I've decided that, we've been doing some modeling of legal documents or contracts, term sheets, and understanding can we analyze these things using logic. So we've analyzed a regulatory text and we've done some analysis on how sort of robust that analysis is when we use large language models to sort of read and interpret and analyze the text versus when we augment that process and include logic-based reasoning. Can I show you?
Perfect. Let's get started.
Just pull up my presentation for you. Okay, so GDPR, European General Data Protection Regulation Modeling and Analysis. So we're going to focus on a piece of GDPR, and I've taken the regulatory text here, and the piece we're going to focus on is an individual's right to erasure. In other words, you must delete my data. And what that means for a company when they receive a request from a user asking to delete that data.
I think GDPR is a great example. Many of the users might know it doesn't apply just to people who are based in EU, but any company or any entity that's collecting data for anyone placed in the EU, they have to comply with the GDPR. So that's definitely a broad example.
And we know that all too well. So
Yeah.
let's get cracking. Okay, so what I'm looking at is particularly these Article 17, which covers off erasure grounds. Then within the articles, it also includes what we call override exemptions. So this is when the company receives the request based on the justification for the request and additional information, the company can override that request and say, no, we get to keep the data for these reasons. What we're going to do, I'll take you through it on the next slide, but I'll show you the process that we followed. So we set out to analyze the articles as I described, and we've done two approaches. One, using Anthropic's Claude Opus 4.5, which until about 2 weeks ago was the market leading model that Anthropic have. We've asked Claude to read the text. What Claude then does is it builds a mental model of what that text means. We gave it, sensible prompts to say that we're going to be analyzing the respective articles. And then we ask it to help us build what the different pathways or the decision tree would look like for that decision process around if somebody requests data erasure, does it have to be complied with? And what does that look like?
That's great. I feel like a lot of sorry, go ahead.
And then I was just going to say, on the right-hand side, we followed the same process, but the subtle steps are different. Rather than the LLM building its own mental model that it's going to be analyzing, Claude's just helping build a codified model using logic that Imandra can then analyze. And it's through that process that we demonstrate more rigor with the analysis.
I feel like a lot of organizations right now, Paul, are looking into how they can use AI in their compliance process, but not a lot of them are asking, okay, what does the verification layer look like? And so I think this slide is a perfect blueprint for that. Let's deep dive into some of the results you might have gotten.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I personally love the sort of efficiencies that the LLMs give me, but then I know I can only use it in scenarios where I can risk accept things going wrong, right? So what we're talking about here is that last mile of rigor.
Yeah, that's the real question. Like, how can you afford to use LLMs and verify that?
So the next two slides, we just showed, I'm showing you the results that Imandra was able to identify, right? So a quick recap, we used Claude to read GDPR. The process with Imandra was then Claude worked with Imandra to build a codified model of what this process flow looked like. And then it delegated to the logic-based reasoning engine the analysis steps. So rather than your typical generative AI large language model performing the analysis, all it did was the interpretation, and then we've used logic-based analysis. What I found was really interesting, right? I also read the text, and I read, look, there are 6 erasure grounds. So these 6 items here are justifications for an individual to request their data to be deleted. And there are 5 different exemptions that companies can use. So I was, in my head, 6 times 5, this is 30. It shouldn't be too difficult. But what Claude and Imandra had done was also model all of the nested subconditions, which there are actually quite a lot of them. And when you complete that analysis, the upshot is there are 812 different pathways through a decision tree one might build for, to serve as a procedure for their, say, operational teams who have to go through the data erasure process. Let's think about this. There's regulatory text. We need to interpret this, and then we need to build a process perhaps that we follow so that we're compliant when dealing with erasure requests. And there are 812 different pathways.
Go ahead.
I know, I was going to say, I was trying to illustrate it here. This makes a bit more sense to sort of convey the way I'm thinking. Erasure grounds are on the left, all of the sub conditions, some of these are nested. This is sort of illustrative purposes only. The 5 exemptions are in this yellow box. And then here are the different possible outcomes. And only 130 of the possible 812 pathways lead to a company having to delete the data.
The 812 number is really interesting, not because it's such a big number, but I'd like to see what the LMs, what number they gave as compared to what Imandra did as well. So I think that'll be a interesting aspect to see while we move
Yeah, of
forward.
course. We did some other work as well that I'm not going to talk about too much today, and that is how we've verified elements of the model. So what I'm showing to you here is how we've discovered the 812 pathways, but we've also verified sort of golden rules that need to be, always true, things like that, where when we build these models, if we can verify something, then you have the assurance it's always the case. But the counter argument there is when we try and prove properties of the systems that we build, we also identify ambiguities. And that's quite interesting because on the next slide, I've got my results. So LLM only or the LLM with Imandra. Now, this is the top row is what we've just discussed. Imandra is able to enumerate, give us the number of, identify each one, and give us an audit trail to show that it is a provably complete set of 812 different pathways. I see we've left the word regions in here. It's a language we use for different distinct pathways or behaviors. We also proved these sort of 18 different properties. Not going too much into it for this conversation. What was also interesting as part of that process where we're proving these golden truths, if you like, of always need to hold true throughout the process flow, Imandra identified 7 different discretionary areas. In other words, areas of the legal text that is subject to interpretation. My read on that is firms then need to appoint their own legal counsel to help them interpret what that means in their context. So you can end up with mismatches from one firm to the next.
Yeah, and discretionary areas are ambiguous on purpose, right?
Mm-hmm.
But LLMs often miss that ambiguity. Operator would assume that they do, but that's always not the case.
Claude would absolutely find some pathways for us.
Yeah.
But the point here is it's not able to enumerate them. It's not able to say how many there should be and how many I have found relative to how many there should be.
Yeah. And you can't manage a risk that's not mapped. So for compliance officers, that's so critical.
Which is a good segue into why this matters. I think you've just answered the first couple on here for me, right? For regulators, this formal analysis can show that we have these areas that are subject to interpretation. Your point zero around for compliance teams, if you're signing off on a model an operations team have built to follow a process as described by a regulation.
Yeah, you need 100% compliance. Otherwise, it's failure. Otherwise, it's fines.
So the final entry on here, I think is really interesting. Firms are talking about AI governance a lot. And there are some very good best practices people are putting in place, whether it's procedural, policy-driven sort of governance techniques. But one thing for sure is that with the addition of logic-based reasoning, we can offer a step change in the performance.
I agree with you, Paul. The other piece that I think is really important is to move from being able to say you're compliant versus being able to prove that you're compliant. And as we move forward, I think the question is going to start becoming, especially for due diligence and even enterprise AI requirements, the question is not, are you using AI? That was our question, let's say 3 years ago. Now the question is going to be, is your AI compliant? And this lets you prove how your AI is compliant. And that's the piece that's really, really powerful.
Takes us to the final slide. I wanted to quickly mention, we've published our own benchmarks on these types of performance measures. So how when AI is used to analyze systems, and by systems, I mean, the design of a process flow as interpreted from regulation, it could be the analysis of code for a safety critical system. But when you're off the shelf large language models, you can kind of read them listed at the bottom of this chart here, perform this type of rigorous analysis. They do okay half the time, but we show a step change when you augment that with logic-based reasoning. So this is a longer read, but I'd love to point people towards our codelogician.dev website. And we've published a paper on there recently, which shows a sort of very rigorous approach to analyzing with versus without logic-based reasoning when dealing with the types of problems listed here.
The main takeaway that I have from the findings, Paul, is it's not don't use LLMs. LLMs are the starting point. But what does that verification layer look like? And, obviously this benchmarking analysis proves that to you. The need for an LLM plus Imandra.
And it's easy to use now, right? I didn't have to do a lot of work to ask the LLM to invoke Imandra to do this.
Yeah.
Those days of having to have that niche specialism are in the rearview mirror.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so easy for someone like me to use. I've been using in my work as an operator. You just add the MCP to your LLM and super easy to use as part of Claude, Cowork, or any other LLM of your choice.
Agree. Well, Zehra, thank you for joining me and listening to this one. I'm really excited. I would love to be speaking to my colleagues and friends and new people as well about the work that we're doing with the analysis of text, right? Whether it be legal documents, compliance policies, process flows, and what we can do to really help people there.
I'm going to use this for my ISO implementation that we have coming up. And I'd also encourage others to use it. It's super impactful.
Well, thank you, Zehra. I won't keep you any longer. I know you're very busy, and talk to you soon.
Thanks, Paul.